Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the mind of Plato, the ancient Greek thinker whose ideas literally built the foundation of Western civilization as we know it. To really wrap your head around the sheer scale of his impact, consider this famous observation made by scholars. All Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. I mean, that is a massive claim, right? But it goes to show exactly why getting a handle on his concepts is absolutely crucial for understanding how we think, how we govern, and even how we learn today. So here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll trace his journey from the student who becomes the master, explore his famous theory of forms and allegory of the cave, look at his design for the ideal society, and finally, his lasting legacy as the architect of Western thought. Okay, part one, the student becomes the master. Picture this. It's roughly 428 BCE. Plato is born into an elite Athenian family, and he gets a world-class education. We're talking music, gymnastics, and mathematics. Now, fun fact here, his real name was actually Aristocles. Plato was basically just a nickname meaning broad. It was kind of like his ancient Greek wrestling name, referring either to his broad shoulders, his broad forehead, or maybe even his broad style of speaking. And with all his family's wealth and political influence, he originally had his sights set on a career in politics. But, everything totally shifted for him when he became a devoted follower of an older philosopher named Socrates. Now, Socrates didn't do stiff, boring lectures, not at all. He taught through questioning and dialogue, choosing these deeply engaging conversations to explore really profound ideas. This completely captivated a young Plato. In fact, it's highly ironic that almost everything we know about Socrates today only survives because Plato wrote it down. Then, in 399 BCE, absolute tragedy strikes. The democratic city of Athens executed Socrates by forcing him to drink poison hemlock, accusing him of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. This event completely shattered Plato's worldview, not to mention his trust in politics. It essentially launched him on a lifelong, globe-spanning quest to places like Egypt and Italy, desperately searching for unshakable truths that a flawed society couldn't just destroy. Which brings us to part two, the theory of forms. So, driven by the tragic laws of his mentor, Plato develops his most famous metaphysical concept to explain what is genuinely real. To do this, Plato essentially splits the universe in half. On one side, you have our physical world, which he argued is imperfect, constantly changing, and made up of mere shadows. But on the other side is the world of forms, this invisible, higher realm of perfect, eternal ideas. He literally believed that everything we see and touch around us is just a flawed, physical copy of these perfect forms. And this explains his absolute obsession with math. He associated this very strict phrase with his school: "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." See, he believed that absolute truths, like a perfectly drawn geometric circle, simply do not exist in the physical world. Any circle you or I draw is going to be slightly flawed, right? The perfect idea of a circle exists only in that higher, invisible world of forms. For Plato, math was the bridge to that ultimate truth. Let's move to part three, the allegory of the cave. To really help ordinary people wrap their heads around this mind-bending concept, Plato crafted what is arguably one of the most brilliant stories in human history. Imagine a group of prisoners who have been chained in total darkness inside a cave their entire lives. All they do is stare at a blank wall, watching shadows cast by a fire behind them. Naturally, they think these shadows are the absolute reality. But then, one prisoner escapes. He walks outside, steps into the blinding sunlight, and finally sees the real world. Only then does it hit him. The shadows were just illusions. So what's he really saying here? Well, it brilliantly illustrates that moving from the cave to the surface is the painful but incredibly necessary journey of education. It's about waking up to the truth. The cave represents our human ignorance and our limited physical understanding of things. The outside world represents absolute truth, knowledge, and enlightenment. Moving from that dark state of limited understanding to ultimate enlightenment is literally the core of his entire philosophy. All right, part four, designing the ideal society. Having established what ultimate truth is, Plato then tackled a very practical human problem. How do we actually build a society that wouldn't, say, execute its wisest teachers? In his masterwork, The Republic, he does something fascinating. He maps human psychology directly onto society. He divided the immortal human soul into three distinct parts. The rational part, which seeks truth, corresponds to the rulers in society, whom he called philosopher kings. The spirited part corresponds to the soldiers, and the appetitive part, which seeks pleasure, corresponds to the producers, like farmers and workers.
The whole takeaway here is that a society is only truly just when truth-seeking philosophers are running the show, just like reason should rule our human emotions. Now, operating objectively, we have to talk about how Plato deeply distrusted democracy. Looking at his criticisms, he genuinely believed that ordinary people are easily manipulated. He thought this created a fear of chaos that could ultimately lead right into tyranny. And of course, we know the deepest personal trauma driving this view. It was a democratic vote that executed his beloved teacher, Socrates. So for sure, he firmly believed philosophers would just make wiser leaders, simply because they seek truth rather than power.
Before we jump into how all of this built his legacy, let's just pause for a second to appreciate his style. Alongside all these heavy political and metaphysical theories, his 30 dialogues are absolutely packed with enduring, bite-sized wisdom. Take this quote, "Courage is knowing what not to fear." It's just a perfect little encapsulation of his belief that knowledge and reason are the ultimate guides for human virtue.
And finally, Part 5, Architect of Western Thought.
Here's the thing. Plato didn't just sit around writing about these ideas. He actually built a physical institution to make sure they survived. Around 387 BCE, he founded the Academy in Athens. It featured a super rigorous curriculum of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, politics, and logic. Guys, this was essentially one of the world's very first universities. And incredibly, it lasted for nearly 9 centuries, educating generations of brilliant minds. And get this, his absolute star student, Aristotle, studied there for 20 years. Now, Aristotle later openly disagreed with Plato's theory of forms, but the culture of rigorous debate that Plato established at the Academy, that changed how humans think forever. Aristotle's famous quote really hits the nail on the head. Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is truth. When you zoom out, his radical ideas went on to profoundly shape civilization as we know it. His concepts of an immortal soul and a higher reality deeply influenced Christian, Islamic, and Jewish philosophy. His relentless pursuit of universal truths paved the way for astronomy and the scientific method. He laid the absolute groundwork for ethics, morality, and psychology. And as we just talked about, he practically invented the modern university system. So, as we wrap up this explainer, let's bring Plato into the modern era for a second. Look around at our world today. We are constantly surrounded by digital screens, endless viral information, and non-stop distractions. Ask yourself, are we seeing the true reality, or are we just staring at shadows on a cave wall? Plato challenged humanity to break the chains of ignorance, and honestly, that challenge feels just as urgent today as it did over 2 millennia ago. Keep seeking the light.